Hello again, it's Dr. Robert Guthrie, and I'm back with what will actually be the next to the last of our lessons. Eric and I have been doing this. Eric's my son-in-law, and he and my daughter and I have been doing this for about 2.5 years since the pandemic started. And we've covered the New Testament and the Old Testament, and now we're wrapping up church history. The church history lessons are just a taste of various church history issues. Today we're going to do the beginning of the Methodist movement, John Wesley and his brother Charles, and Methodism, and it's John Wesley particularly is kind of the last of the gigantic figures of the Reformation era. Clearly, you've got Martin Luther, Ignatius Loyola, John Calvin. John Wesley's probably the fourth of the major ones, and he developed the Methodist system, which is actually quite different than the Calvinist system. Different theology, different organization, different style and nuance and all that. And so he's actually had a tremendous impact on Christianity since his time. He was born in 1703 in England and died in 1791, so he had a long life and a very active one. His worldwide impact is up there with Luther, Loyola, who was the Catholic Reformation person, and Calvin. Calvin spun off not only the Presbyterian church system, but many of the Baptist churches trace their system back to Calvin, and particularly here in the United States, the Baptists are quite powerful and prominent. Wesley has had tremendous impact here in the United States also, because Methodism took off here before and after the American Revolution, and it's had lasting impact. He's an interesting character. He and his brother were a close pair of people, both at college and through their early adulthood and the beginning of their ministry, and they stayed together a long time. John and Charles went to Oxford. They were one of multiple children of an Anglican pastor. It's a middle-class upbringing, like Luther's was, like Loyola's was, like Calvin's was. These were not people from the bottom of society. They were kind of in the middle. And most good leaders on rising up to achieve great reform come from either the upper classes or from the middle classes. They don't come up from the bottom very often. It's so hard in those days to break out from the lower classes into the middle and upper class, go to university and all that. So they went they were, again, their father was a routine Anglican pastor in a community church type situation. And they had like 15 or 16 children. His mother was very strong, very capable, very wise, and raised them well. John and Charles went to Oxford. John graduated in 1726. He was ordained as an Anglican pastor, which is Church of England, and he went off and did pastoral work for 3 years. And it's interesting how you do see the similarity here between Luther and Loyola and Wesley. It's hard to tell about Calvin's inner psyche because he kept that very much to himself. But those three were unfulfilled in their 20s and early 30s, even though Luther was a monk and then a priest and then a theology professor. And Loyola was a warrior and got into church work. And Wesley was originally unfulfilled in his ministry. I don't think he was all that happy. He wasn't cut out to be that kind of small church administrative pastor like his father was. So after 3 years, he goes back to Oxford in a pastoral role. And he and his brother had gone back earlier and started something called the Holy Club. The Holy Club was a voluntary group for students who were very spiritual, very religious, and they wanted to have a way to gather and associate with each other and continue to develop in the faith. And John becomes the president of it. He clearly has significant administrative skills, which is very important when you're starting a movement like this. And so he's president there for several years. And one of his concepts, he had 4 concepts that emerged. that have lasted since that time. One of his concepts emerges during his time as the Holy Club when he's in his early to mid-20s, and this was the social gospel. Now, to understand this, you have to understand what the Anglican Church was like in English society in the 1720s, 1730s. English society was extremely aristocratic at this time. The aristocratic, the wealthy landed elite who inherited their wealth, really ran the country. They controlled the seats of Parliament, not only in the House of Lords, but the House of Commons, and the aristocrats ran the country. Now, the Industrial Revolution was beginning, so you were starting to get the emergence of some people with wealth from businesses. But the aristocrats owned the land, they had the hereditary wealth. Some of them became fabulously wealthy if they were sitting on coal deposits or something like that. And they really ran the country. They also ran the Anglican Church. The church was dominated in its administrative levels. If you had grown up in a middle or upper middle class family and even in a wealthy family, and you really weren't cut out to be the landowner or to be a soldier, because the army was dominated by aristocratic soldiers, because the British Army sold their officer ranks, their commissions. You'd buy one for a lot of money. In the Navy, the same thing. If you weren't cut out to do that, like me, they would send you to the church. So you had the church is dominated by the aristocrats, and the aristocrats take care of themselves and take care of each other, and they really weren't comfortable reaching out to the people at the bottom. So the Holy Club is the first one to go into the prisons, the jails, and minister to the poor and really just terribly disadvantaged people there. This was a scandal. They went in and associated with the riffraff. Well, that's who needs Jesus. That's who needs God. And if you're at the bottom like that, and then also you can help them out, get them better food, get them better accommodations, get them better prison conditions. So this becomes the social gospel. And this is developed by the people at the Holy Club with the Wesleys, and this becomes a dominant movement in Christianity really from the 1730s when it started up really through the 1920s, 1930s. It was very powerful here. When it came to the U.S., it had several very moralistic missions, and they were well founded. It was anti-slavery, it was missionary, and it was to care for not only the spiritual needs of the poor people, but their other needs. So they ran orphanages, they had schools, they taught people how to read, they had kindergarten type things, and developed hospitals. So this is the social gospel, and it really comes from the Holy Club and the Wesleys. This is the first of their things that emerges. But John, even with this, John and Charles really weren't fulfilled emotionally. Kind of like Luther, they were active in the church, they believed in it intellectually, they had not had an emotional movement, like Loyola also, not had an emotional movement to really bond their heart, not their mind, and their heart into the faith. So they decide, well, they'll go off to America as missionaries. The Moravians, which are a small church, still small, which grew up in the Czech Republic area and parts of Germany, and the Moravians were very missionary oriented. Even clerical people, non-clergy, would go off as missionaries, particularly to the New World. So they, under that influence, they'll go to Georgia. Georgia's very, very poorly developed. This is the last of the colonies. 1735 is when they go, and there's not much there. John goes as the missionary to the Indians, and Charles goes as the secretary to Governor Oglethorpe. And as a 3-year sojourn, it was a bust. The Indians had no interest in whatever John Wesley was offering at that time, none. And Charles wasn't any happier either. John has a love interest with a young woman. I know nothing about it, not any of the details, and that goes bust also. Excuse me a second. So that was a failure. So after 3 years, they chuck it and go back. And they go back to Oxford. And a couple months later, John is at a service in Oxford, and he suddenly has, his heart was strangely warmed. I'm reading this off my notes because that's his description of it. He suddenly has this emotional movement that took his intellectual faith and made it emotional in his heart. his heart was suddenly warmed. This was back to Luther. And so he decides to change, and he just wants to become an itinerant pastor. He's already ordained, he's already an Anglican pastor. So he starts being an itinerant pastor, going around to various Anglican churches and preaching. And how that went is hard to tell. I suspect not as well as he had hoped, because he's not only intellectually stimulated to do this, he's emotionally committed to do this now. And after a while, his friend George Whitefield, who had been part of the Holy Club with him, says to him, or inspires him, to go and preach in the open air. Now, George Whitefield was the first of the roaming evangelists who would travel around. He traveled around Britain, he traveled around the United States. It was actually the American colonies in those days, and he preached in the open, and apparently he was quite the charismatic preacher. He put on a great show. Some of the people really resented him, saying, is this really a sincere preacher of the gospel, or is he just someone who puts on a good show? I don't know. He did not leave anything behind. He was not an organization person. He didn't have any administrative skills. He just went out and did his own thing, and then he died. That was the end of it. But he did inspire Wesley to try this. So Wesley goes out and starts preaching out in the open, particularly to the people at the bottom, because he was interested not just in saving the souls of the comfortable, elitist, prosperous people who came to church every Sunday. He was interested in saving the souls of the people at the bottom, the people who were remember the Industrial Revolution is starting at this time in England, and so you had a lot of coal miners. Nobody cared about the coal miners. You had a lot of people who ran shops and stuff like that, and were beginning to have workers in the industry. Nobody cared about them. And Wesley was the first person to really go out and reach out to them. And there's famous stories about preaching to the coal miners on the afternoon when they're getting off work, and no one had ever preached to them before. And their tears are coming down their face because they're just tears of joy at someone's trying to reach out to them, to share God's love with them, because everybody just treated them like dirt. They were just hired hands. They were, kind of like you rented your slaves in that situation rather than owned them. So this became his mission. And with that, he's bringing along the social gospel, which we've talked about, and he's trying to minister to these people. So he's trying to help them with all the sociological problems going on in their culture. And as he's beginning to develop his own movement, he develops a couple other policies, one of which we've just seen here, which is take the church to the people. Don't make the people come to you in the high fancy cathedral where they may not be comfortable. Take the church to the people. So he would ride all over England, all over Wales, all over Scotland, all over Ireland, taking the message to the people. Here in the U.S., he had come once, before we were the U.S., but his followers after the Revolution developed the circuit riders. Our church, Jerome United Methodist, is an old circuit rider church from the early 19th century. And there's a whole pattern here. The circuit rider system worked very well. They would ride the circuit. They would come maybe on a Tuesday evening, and they'd have a church service that evening and stay in the house of one of the more prominent members who had an extra bedroom they would create for the circuit rider. And then they'd have a Sunday school for the kids in the morning and help everybody with it, learning to read and write. And then they'd move on the next day to the next. And it worked really well. It allowed the church, particularly here where the distances aren't nearly as great, to maintain this circuit of about a 2-week circle and grow the Methodist Church extremely well. So he took the church to the people as the second thing. The third thing was his theology. Theology was very different than Calvin. Calvin's theology was predestination. That, yes, you are saved by God's grace, which is what all the Christian churches believe that. And that Calvin thought that it was known in advance who's going to accept this and be saved and who isn't. And that's emotionally, that seems a very restricted group. That the predestination group is not open to everybody. It's kind of, God's picked these people, he's going to save them. And that's the way it is. And his belief was called, Arminianism. And Wesley believed, as I believe, I grew up in a Calvinist church, and I'm a Methodist now, and happy about it. That Jesus came to save everybody, not just this limited number of the elect, but everybody. So the salvation is there for the taking, if you want it, if you will agree to it. That we need, as Christians, to take the message to the non-believers. There's lots of them around. So that was Arminian. It's a very simple approach. And it's no different than the early church. You go back to Paul's issue. This is what Luther did. He went back to Paul's writings to get himself motivated. You go back, he was reaching out to all sorts of people, to the Greeks, to the Jewish people, all sorts of people. So that's Arminianism. And the last thing was sanctification. And it sounds similar to the Baptist approach, but it really isn't. Sanctification, and Wesley said that if you are truly a Christian, then you want to live a holy life as a valid representative to the other people of your faith. And this has focused on a variety of issues, and I think it's an important thing. If you're truly a Christian, you want to live not only a moral life, but a generous, loving life also. You don't want to be a crabby Christian. You don't want to be a ruthless, cheating businessman Christian. You don't want to be personally immoral, cheating on your spouse or things like that. So he said you want to live this joyous life of salvation that you've been given by God and share it that way by living this life. Now, he particularly focused on alcohol. Now, and I can explain this because I understand it. There is no scriptural prohibition on alcohol or gambling, which is the other one he focused on somewhat. But he recognized in the culture to whom he was ministering, the working class people of England, Wales, and Scotland, and Ireland, the big curse on that culture was alcohol. I spent a year in Scotland back in college, and let me tell you, the alcohol consumption there was unbelievable. That's what everybody did all the time. And what would happen with his working class people, they would get off, finish their work week, which was probably Saturday afternoon at the time. They didn't have 2-day weekends, or even, maybe it was even Friday, maybe they had 2 days, I don't really know. And they'd get paid in cash. So if the guy stopped at the local ale house, I think is what they called them in those days, and drank up all his money, went home drunk with no money, beat his wife and kids up because he was a nasty drunk, they're much worse off than if he had said, okay, I'm not going to go home and drink. I'm going to go home and then share the money, and we'll have decent food, and we can get kids shoes and stuff like that. And so the real issue, I think, behind his alcohol prohibition was to protect this working class group from this potential, not a guaranteed curse on them, but a potential curse on them, which can be quite powerful. I come from a family of big drinkers, and I've seen how destructive it is. So I don't drink at all. Is there anything, does that make me morally better? No, I'm just being cautious about what's good for me. And I have family members that'll have modest amounts of wine and stuff like that. No big deal. But sanctification, which he pushed, was a particular problem in his population to whom he was ministering. And therefore, he really did it. Now, you probably would be preaching against gambling now also, because gambling is starting to take off here in the United States. You got all kinds of, they advertise gambling on TV if you're watching a sporting event. So gambling is going to become a huge problem also, and he would be against that because it's, again, one of those curses, not immoral, but it's pathological in the way you live. So that's where sanctification comes in. You should leave the good moral life. I think it's not just control your drinking and stuff like that, is control your business practices. If you're a successful businessman, don't be ruthless and nasty to your employees. Don't be cheating on your business associates and stuff like that. So sanctification to me means leading a joyfully moral life, because you choose to do that to show God's blessing, that God has blessed you with this. And it's not the negative way that I picked up from the Baptists and people I knew in the South and the growing up in the Presbyterian system, where you can't do this and you can't play cards and you can't dance, and there's nothing in the scriptures that says you can't play cards or you can't dance. King David danced in the nude when he brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. So nothing about it. These are things that came out of their past. So that was sanctification. And that was a good system at the time. And it's a good check on excess alcohol, because excess alcohol can be a terrible problem. I've seen it. So you have this very interesting group of developments, theologically and lifestyle-wise, which really contrast, because it's a positive tone. If you live this sanctified life, it's good for you, it's a good message, it's a good message to your family and your friends and the people who know you, blah, blah, blah. As opposed to the Calvinistic approaches, no, these things are all, okay. But I think it's a better one, just from the overall positivity of God's love, you can share it. Now, he was not trying to start an independent church. He was trying to reform the Anglican church from inside. He wasn't Anglican at the time. And what happens is the American Revolution comes along. He had been ordaining Anglican priests prior to the Revolution and sending them to North America to expand, and this is where the circuit rider thing developed, to expand the outreach of the church in North America, mainly in the United States. We had a lot more people than Canada did. And the revolution starts, and he basically tells the people in North America to sit it out. The church is not going to take sides in the fight, because it was a nasty fight. And so at the end of the revolution, the Americans win. So what does he do? Well, he can't ordain a Church of England pastor and send a Church of England pastor to the newly independent United States. So he decides to take his Methodist societies, which he had been running as a subunit of the Anglican Church, and make his own church so that he could create the Methodist Church. He could ordain his own pastors in the Methodist Church and send them to the U.S. And they could continue the missionary activity there. And so that's what happened. So it's interesting how the division of the church was driven by politics. In this situation, the American Revolution, our freedom and individuality, and rather than by a fundamental theological split that could not be reversed, as you had with Luther and Calvin and stuff like that. So that's very interesting. Now, the personal comment is, this guy, and I have great respect for him, tremendous admiration for him theologically, and great respect. He had to be the loneliest man in the world. And that's more of a consideration and concern rather than anything. He had this failed attempt to have a romance in Georgia. He was planning, actually got back later, it's not clear when, he was planning to get married, and his brother Charles vetoed it. I don't know how that happened or why that happened, but it did. And so he's off riding his horse everywhere, ministering all the time. When he gets to be 48, a widow with 4 children decides she's going to marry him. She makes the big push on him, and they get married, and it's a disaster. They break up very quickly. They try to reestablish and break up again, reestablish, but 3 or 4 times. Finally, he's done with it. And he never should have gotten married anyway. So it's interesting. Being a saint can really be tough. Being married to a saint can be really tough, because these saints are always off on the road doing this and doing that, and because they're doing God's will, they are not going to compromise doing God's will for the family needs. So it's tough. But it must have been a lonely life. This guy rode his horse 250,000 miles in his lifetime. That's 10 times around the earth at the equator. Now, if you've ever ridden horses long distance, which I have many times, we grew up with horses, and we rode horses out in the national parks and stuff like that. And if you've ridden long distance on a horse, it is really uncomfortable. There's no other word for it. Your back hurts, your posterior hurts, you're aching, you're stiff, you're bouncing along. It's really tough. So this guy really was dedicated and was willing to put himself out to greatly, have great admiration for him. That's real dedication to do that. But it must have been tough on the lonely side. His brother Charles, however, gets and John was technically married. They never had any children or anything like that. Charles gets married about age 40, stays in the Church of England, even though he works in the Methodist societies, gets married when he gets a church in Bristol, settles in there, has 8 kids, so he clearly got along with his wife to a certain degree. They have 8 children. And his great skill, which we still see nowadays, of course, was he wrote 6,500 hymns. That's a lot of hymns. I mean, Luther wrote about 600. I think we got one of Luther's still in Mighty Fortress is Our God, still in our hymn. But we have 51 of Charles Wesley's hymns in our current Methodist hymnal, and 8 poems. So that's a lot of hymns and poems. He's one of the great hymn writers of all time, along with Isaac Watts, Fanny Crosby. He's one of the great ones. And he's got 2 of my favorites, which are classic ones for the season. Christ the Lord is risen today. You couldn't have a better title for an Easter hymn. And Hark the Herald Angels Sing. What a rousing Christmas hymn. So they're still in our thing. So John and Charles, particularly John, had a massive theological impact that we have now. You have the 4 things he developed. One was the social gospel, which really drove hard in the United States. The Methodist Church here did orphanages and helped the rights of the native population, was a leading of the slavery abolition movements, colleges, hospitals, all sorts of things from the social gospel. An interesting and all-inclusive theology, Arminianism, that Jesus came to save everybody, not just us, but the Chinese and the people in Latin America and everywhere, everybody. Sanctification, which is leading a healthy life, a morally healthy and therefore physically healthy life as part of as a representation of your faith to the outside. No problem with that. And then the theological, the pastoral message of taking the message to the people, which is what we did with the circuit riders here. Even what I'm trying to do by putting this out on YouTube so anybody can look at this. So it's a very interesting, very powerful impact that the Wesleys had, particularly John, but also Charles. It's a fascinating story. Now we have one more lesson left, which we'll do in a couple weeks. And that's going to be the Methodist story in America, which is a very complicated story. And it still remains complicated. So again, my thanks to Eric, my technical school crew, along with our daughter Brianna, Eric's wife. And it's a pleasure to do this. I'll see you in a week or two. This is Dr. Guthrie.